this project in many ways is a something old, something new talk. The sources that I'm talking about, I first came up within the archives as I was researching this project, with some of them as much as 5 or 6 years ago. But they didn't really fit in the story for the book manuscript, which is about working class children. So increasingly lately I've been thinking about, what can I do with these immigrant children? And so I'm hoping to draft an article about this, and I'll look forward to hearing some of your feedback about this. So I want to begin in the morning of April 3rd, 1898 at 1:20, so very early in the morning. And it's at this time that two Parisian policemen are on their beat in a central neighborhood in Paris. If we look at the map, this is kind of a silly map, but I really like it because it has all the monuments. You see these arches that are sort of in the north, and it's in this neighborhood, which is called Saint-Denis, the sort of Faubourg Saint-Denis, that the police come across 3 children who are begging. And these children are 9-year-old Alfred, 7-year-old Gertrude, and 6-year-old Goldina Gerson. They're all siblings, and they're all across from this arch, so they could probably see it. And so the police pick up these children, and then they launch an investigation into what's going on with this family. They want to get a sense of whether children begging at 1:20 in the morning is not what you'd expect them to be doing, and they want to know if this is something that their parents have been making them do more often. So they start to ask the neighbors of this family. As with most working class people in Paris, they live in this kind of apartment building. And they find that the children's mother, whose name was Anna Gerson, was, quote, living off of her children's begging, and, quote, had a bad reputation. So that was not good. So this then goes up to a judge, a civil judge, who has to decide what's going to happen with the children, and he decides to place them in a charitable home. He takes them away from their parents. And his justification is that the mother is violating a law that bans parents from placing children in wandering professions below a certain age, so things like begging, things like street musicians. But also there's another law that allows the state to take children away from their parents if the state deems that they're not giving their children the right kind of moral upbringing, if they're somehow failing their children. And so this is what the judge can point to in taking these children from the parents. So let me now introduce another element to the story. Here we have, a child beggar. So interestingly enough, all of these children and their parents are, in fact, Jewish immigrants. The children are listed as being born in London. If we look at, here's the receipt of their arrest. It says Londres, which is London in French. And the mother was, in fact, born in Moscow. And all these documents say that, in fact, they are Jewish. Interestingly, the mother's language is listed as being German, which I take to probably be Yiddish. And so when the judge actually takes the children away from their parents, he doesn't place them in a public home, something run by the state, which is usually what he would do in this case, nor does he place them in a home run by a Catholic charity, which is the other thing these judges usually do, but he actually places them in Jewish institutions. So now I imagine for some of you the question that springs to mind is there some kind of anti-immigrant bias operating here? Is there some kind of anti-Semitic bias that may be guiding this sequence of events? And in fact, this process of a judge deciding that a parent was immoral and taking their children away from them is not exceptional. That there's a number of records of the police, of various welfare institutions, where the state does invoke this law that I mentioned, and take children and decides that parents are giving their children like an immoral upbringing, and decides to take these children away. But what I think is significant and is perhaps guided by some kind of anti-immigrant perception is the way in which both the police and the family's neighbors view this mother, right? They see her as indolent, they see her as unable to earn a living, and they also, and maybe not specifically, but they're thinking about the fact that she's not able to observe the child labor laws, that there are laws in France that, create a certain condition of childhood, and she somehow doesn't really understand them, and she's choosing not to apply them. So if we zoom out a little bit more, that in fact, when the police are going around and counting beggars in this period, they will talk about Jews, right? There's this perception that Jewish families are sending out their children to beg. And so this speaks to this larger perception that in fact, these immigrant communities are unable to respect French norms around work, and more importantly, that they're not respecting French norms around childhood, that they somehow are not giving their children the version of childhood that the state deems as appropriate. And so it's this tension over immigrant communities' ability or lack thereof to recognize childhood that I want to focus on today in this talk. So France, like the United States, has a long history of being a destination for immigrants. In 1900, it's one of the countries in Western Europe that has the largest immigrant populations. And it also is a republic in this period and then today. There's, a gap in the middle where that doesn't happen. But for most of the last 150 years, it's been a republic that very much has this political rhetoric of a commitment to liberty and equality. And what this then leads to is the sense that there is space for assimilation, that in the particular form of government that exists in France, that immigrants can come and they can take on French citizenship, that this is possible. But, right, as many of you probably know, France equally has a history of xenophobia and no, that is deliberate. And so this tradition of xenophobia and exclusion calls into question whether or not this assimilation is in fact what happens. And as we saw in the case of the Gerson family, right, this family with the child beggars, the police and their various neighbors do see this family as incapable of assimilation, right? So the limit of assimilation is being placed on them as that they somehow are unable to access French laws, that they're unable to follow these French laws and accept French norms. And so what this then tells us is that perhaps these French-born people are viewing immigrants as unable to give their children childhood, that the failure of this particular family perhaps signals a larger failure within their community to assimilate to French standards. In my book manuscript, which as I mentioned, I look at working class childhood in late 19th and early 20th century France, a more complicated picture emerges, and that's what I want to talk about in this talk. In my research, what I found is that immigrant children are a small minority of the overall workforce, but they're disproportionately represented among violations of child labor laws. And what that means is that they're working underage, that labor inspectors will find them working in sweatshops and hazardous conditions, or various other things that are set out in the child labor laws to protect children that various labor inspectors find children in these conditions. And that when labor inspectors investigated these cases, what they found is it's not simply a case of immigrant parents just placing these children in hazardous conditions and failing to observe French standards of childhood. What in fact is going on is even if the parents are placing these children in these situations, it required French employers and French officials' cooperation, right? And that what we see is through their collaboration, French employers, for instance, are choosing not to observe child labor laws when it came to immigrants. And what this signals is that they're envisioning a hierarchy within childhood, right? That there's some children who are French-born who the laws apply to, and there are other children who are foreign-born who the laws do not apply to. And then the other part of this is that, we have to look at the perspective of immigrant parents. In many cases, they're coming from countries where there aren't child labor laws on the books. That for them, there is a norm that children work from a young age. And that they come to France, all of a sudden they're confronted with this regime of child labor legislation, which in many cases is very technocratic. It's technocratic in a language that they're not familiar with. So it's not necessarily that they're choosing not to accept a French standard of childhood, but in fact, they're having trouble accessing this notion of childhood. And then they find these people who do, in fact, French employers, who actually know what they're supposed to be doing and choose to violate it when it comes to with foreign children. So what this tells us is in this period, when the French state is trying to create a more universal version of childhood, is trying to legislate into existence a more standardized version of childhood, the repeated exclusions of these immigrant children from these norms around childhood demonstrate the limits of these efforts to universalize childhood. But what I'm going to argue in this talk is that the failure of assimilation is a two-way street, that we see that it's both the immigrant communities, but also French-born individuals who are choosing to envision this hierarchy within childhood and treating these children as somehow different and outside the laws. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to provide a little bit of context on what's going on in childhood in late 19th century France, and then also in terms of immigration, what's going on in France. And then I'm going to dig into a particular example that will let us see all the various dynamics that lead to these children being excluded from the workforce, or excluded from the provisions of the child labor laws. So the period that my research focuses on is a period called the Third Republic in France. There's 5 today. We don't need to know the numbers, but what is important about this republic is it goes from about 1870 to 1940. The period I'm talking about, though, ends with World War I. And it's a regime that very much proclaims its commitment to liberty and equality. It looks back to the French Revolution, like it's sort of the ideals of the French Revolution. And this is why I always like to use this image, because this is Republic, right? You have a statue in the center of Paris that's personifying Republic. And around the base, it's demonstrating all these various ideals of the French Revolution that this Republic is going to institute into French society. However, right, this is a republic that fails in many cases to live up to this potential. It is the government that expands the French colonial empire, and it also never gives women the right to vote. So it has universal manhood suffrage, which at this point is fairly exceptional within Europe, but it doesn't, take the next steps to really live up to these ideals. And the Republic's approach to working-class childhood very much captures this tension between this ideal of equality and then the reality of what's happening on the ground. So in its first couple of decades, the Republic passes a number of pivotal policies aimed at children. They set these child labor laws that I keep talking about. They also they universalize primary education. Primary education becomes universal and free and public. They also create specific courts for juvenile delinquents. And they expand the welfare state for children, right? So there's a series of policies that are meant to protect children. And all of these policies derive from an understanding that childhood is this particular developmental stage, that a government has a responsibility to protect children in this young, vulnerable stage. And the other thing is this idea that childhood can be defined, that there are parameters around childhood, that it begins and ends at specific stages. So the laws are in many ways trying to encode and protect working-class children. But what I argue in my book manuscript is that in many ways these policies actually act as a tool of social control. That, if you're directing children into certain kinds of schools, if you're trying to protect the conditions of their work, if you're putting them into certain juvenile homes, ultimately the goal is to ensure that working-class children become productive working-class adults. So this sort of attempt to protect children is not necessarily trying to universalize adulthood, but instead trying to protect vulnerable young bodies to make them into workers. And the Republic's treatment of immigrants and foreigners also captures this tension between Republican ideals and practice. So in the 1870s and 80s, immigrants constituted about 3% of the French population and about 7 to 8% of the workforce. And in Paris, we have to imagine that's going to be a little bit higher. In the period leading up to World War I, the majority of immigrants were from France's neighbors. So if we look at the map, right, France's neighbor to the north is Belgium, and then to the south is Italy. And so as you can probably expect, the areas in France that have the largest concentration of immigrants are the north and the southern areas by Italy. But then in the 1880s, there's a series of pogroms in Central and Eastern Europe, right, in Poland and the Russian Empire, and that acts as a push factor. And so what you have then is a westward migration of Jewish immigrants, many who've come to France, a lot who also go to places like Britain or the US. And so as a result of kind of this rising wave of immigration, but also because the Republic is, rethinking notions of citizenship, in the 1880s it passes a new law around citizenship. And what this law mandates is that any child who's born to immigrants in France, so a child who is born in France to immigrants, once they reach the age of majority, which actually in the 19th century is 21, which is interesting, can claim French citizenship. So if you're born in France, you can claim French citizenship. And so what this law implies is that French citizenship is not based on race or ethnicity, that there's not some inherent notion of Frenchness that only people who are French can access, but that other people can come to French and access French citizenship and participate in the political process. And this is, again, an idea that comes out of the French Revolution, the sense that French citizenship is political, that it's not national. And again, this is not the norm in other places in Europe in this time. And to this day, in fact, it's illegal to compile statistics on ethnicity in France. That, you go to take a standardized test in the US and you have to bubble in, who you are and where you're from. If you are French, you are French. You are a French citizen, full stop, right? As many of you probably are thinking, well, that doesn't really seem to be the case. And you're right to be thinking that. But this is the ideal, right? The ideal is that French citizenship is possible, is available, and that one can assimilate and gain French citizenship. So due to time constraints, I can't go into all the various ways this ideal breaks down. The most notorious example is the Dreyfus Affair, which is something that happens in the 1890s. There's a Jewish army officer who is blamed for selling state secrets. It creates this huge, huge scandal, and it becomes the political issue of the 1890s, to the extent that that is where the political cleavages break down in the 1890s, whether or not you support this particular Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus. But the result of this is that there's a huge wave of anti-Semitism in the 1890s. It becomes very much a part of the political discourse. And this shows us, right, this notion of citizenship as being accessible is in fact not really the reality, even in political debates within the Republic. But it's not just Jews who are subjected to some of this, that there's violence against Italians and Belgians in the 1890s. So clearly, right, this ideal of Republican citizenship is already breaking down within the Republic. So what I want to look at then is how people are making these distinctions at sort of a micro level. How do individuals choose to see various individuals as French or as foreign, right? And what these categories mean to people. And that's why looking into categories that to us seems as universal as childhood is very instructive. Okay, so let me just give you a brief word about the child labor laws, and then I promise I will get into my case study. So the Republic has two pivotal child labor laws it passes, both almost immediately in 1874 and then 2 decades later in 1892. And what you need to know about these is they set conditions around children's work. So they set a minimum age of employment, right? First it's 12, then it's 13. Children below 13 can't work. They mandate that children who are in the workforce need to have a day off a week. They mandate that children cannot work at nights. And they say that children can only work 12 hours a day. So if you're doing the math, that means that, in fact, 13-year-olds can work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, which is a lot. But this is progress, right? And this is also different than what the regime that adults are subject to. So there are specific conditions for children. The other thing these laws set out is that children have to have a work permit, which is called a livret. And this is a way of keeping track of them, right? How do you ensure that a child is 12 or 13? And then the other aspect of these laws is they set out conditions for their enforcement. They create a corps of labor inspectors whose job it is to go into all these various industrial spaces and observe, are employers following the laws? And these guys, the labor inspectors, and some girls, there's a small number of female labor inspectors, are the people who produce the sources that allow us to see what's going on in these spaces. So as I'm talking about this particular case, keep in mind that it is labor inspectors who are compiling the records. So the most frequent instance of foreign children employed in the workforce is Italian children employed in glassworks in a Parisian suburb of Pantin. Okay, I think this is working. I have a hard time seeing it. So if you look all the way up in that corner, the little green space, so Paris has city walls, which are still in existence in this period. Today it's now a highway, actually, which is really neat. The highway on the borders of Paris still follows the track of the city walls. But in that north corner, there's a suburb called Pantin. And in the 19th century, there's a lot of small little villages that are just beyond the city walls. And in the north, a lot of those are where the industry is taking place. Today, that's actually where the police archives are, which is kind of ironic. And it's a very multicultural, but also increasingly gentrifying neighborhood today. Anyway, so these are where the glassworks are. And the inspectors go in and they find these violations. And it's the investigations of these inspections that allow us to see the dynamics that are allowing immigrant children to work in these illegal conditions. And allow us to see the variety of people who are cooperating and collaborating to enable these violations. So the illegal transport of Italian children to work in the glassworks really starts in the 1890s in the south of France, right? If we think about the map, that's where the areas in France that were closer to Italy. But it becomes more a problem in the Paris region in the first decade of the 20th century. So in 1901, a labor inspector by the name of Droncourt goes into a glassworks, and there are children who have livrets that claim that they're of age, but this labor inspector suspects that something is off. And here we have some of the documentation. So keep in mind, this is a labor inspector. His job is to go into factories and watch children working. So his expert knowledge, in many cases, supersedes the written record because he has such an intuitive sense of what children's bodies look like and what a 12-year-old body looks like and what a 13-year-old body looks like. So he knows that something's wrong, and he goes to the police, and sure enough, the police find that there's something wrong. So what the inspectors uncover is that there's a whole network of individuals who are working together to ensure that these children are working in these glassworks. So in the first inspection, they find a father whose name is Galecchio. And he had maintained a livret illegally from a city hall in another of these little towns, like straight up into the north, just off of where the sort of main boulevard is going, which is the suburb of Saint-Denis. He goes to the local city hall there and gets a livret, which is not legal. And then a mother, Alia Raphael, had been using a livret of one of her dead children and had given it to a living child. And that was how she was able to get this her living child in the workforce. And so then the police are like, okay, something really is up, and they raid the factory, and they discovered that, in fact, that 4 more livrets had been falsified, one of which didn't even go through the local city hall, but had the signature of the director of this factory, a guy named by the name of Bernard Hoek. And the fact that he had signed it signals that he's complicit with all of this, right? That he's cooperating to ensure these children are in the workforce. Okay, so the number of individuals involved in this scheme is probably very overwhelming, right? There's a lot of different moving pieces. But why that's significant is it shows us just how many people are involved in placing these children in these situations, right? It's not simply Italian parents who are placing these children in the workforce and trying to find ways to subvert the system. We see that the director of the factory is willing to take in underage children. And that when the legal channels fail, when they can't get the people in the city hall to cooperate with them, he even finds ways to help them forge these livrets. And moreover, we see that the official at this local city hall, who is the very individual who is supposed to be protecting these children, who's supposed to be ensuring that they have the proper documentation, he too is also signing these and enabling these various violations. So the question is why, right? And the cynical answer is money. All of these various individuals stand to gain from these children entering the workforce illegally. In the case of the parents, if you send your child to work and you don't send them to school, you get money, right? And this helps the family economy, and perhaps these families very much did need this extra money they could gain. And for the factory owners, they actually stand to gain a lot. Part of this is that the task the children is doing is really unpleasant and unskilled. And this gives us a sense of this. What the children would do is they would go to the ovens, they'd get the molten glass in these ovens that was melting, and then they'd carry it over to a glass blower who would blow it into a bottle. So this is something that is unpleasant. It requires very little skill. The factory owners don't want to pay an adult to do this job. If they take an underage child, they get it at an even more of a bargain because the parents are so desperate to put this child in the workforce, and it's hard to find an employer who will break the laws. So the factory owners, this arrangement works out quite well. And we have to imagine too that the corrupt employee at the city hall who signs off on all of this also gets some kind of bribe. So he also probably gains from this. But it's not simply money, right? It's not simply all these people choosing to make money off of the children. What they're all choosing to do is recognize that these children are different, or seeing these children as somehow beyond the applicability of child labor laws. So there's a decision that all these various individuals are making that the child labor laws don't apply to these Italian immigrant children. So the initial investigation that I just went through into this factory does not stop the flow of children working in glassworks. There are other factories. And part of the problem is that the labor inspectors quite simply cannot change the way that all these individuals envision childhood. Right? They can't force them to see the Italian children as somehow the same as French children. And what they find out as well is that they're fighting a much larger network. So in fact, there are individuals called padroni who go to Italy, they'll go to Italian families and they'll recruit children, and then they'll smuggle the children across the border and place them in jobs in France. So they too are making money off the children. Sorry. And so as the French get smarter and find ways to try to prevent this, so too do the padroni. They will steal livrets and try to attach them to children. They will also swap livrets between different children, right? We saw that with some of these other families before. In 1909, so now we're 8 years after the first investigation, the inspectors find 3 children between the ages of 10 and 12 working in a factory. Now, these children were working at night. And the foreman of this factory had thought, this is a way to avoid the labor inspector. We'll place them at a time we don't think the inspector will show up. And in fact, the inspector does show up. So what's happening then is all these individuals are continuing to see these children as in some ways as commerce, right? Something that can be smuggled across the border and needs to be hidden and kept in these various spaces. So to return to the parents then, what leads them to be treating their children in many ways as illicit commerce? And if we look at the labor inspections report, they're sort of divided on whether or not the parents are in fact blissfully ignorant or deliberately complicit in this situation. But what I want to suggest is if we look at the relative lateness of Italian child labor legislation, we actually have some clues. So even though the Italians had banned child labor legislation, had banned children in wandering professions from the 1870s, they allowed children as young as 9 to work, right? So in Italy, the norm, in fact, is that young children could work, right? So that is the reality on that side of on the Italian side of the border. And it's only in 1902 that the Italian government bans children from working in industry, children under 12. But then they create this flexible space between 10 and 12 that children who are already in the workforce can keep working. So then the laws are not quite as absolute. And it's only in 1907 that the Italian government bans children under 12 in the workforce. So now let's think back. In France, these laws were in place from 1874. So it's 40 years later in Italy that they're passing the laws. So what this means then is that for Italian families, it's not illegal to place young children in the workforce. In fact, it's the norm. And they're also confronting a situation where in France the birth rate is going down, and in Italy the birth rate is going up. So it's harder to find jobs for these children. So what I envision is happening is that in the early 20th century, right, the first incident happens in 1901, the Italians are passing the law in 1902, Italian families are being confronted with a new labor regime in their own country, and so they look for an alternative, because for them, it's the norm that children work. And so they look to France, and they find people in France who are willing to treat their children as outside of the regime in their own country. And so the case of the glassworks is all the more intriguing because it allows us to see how something as universal as childhood is being treated so differently on either side of a border, right? France and Italy are right next to each other. And what I do want to emphasize is that I'm not simply saying, oh, you know, the Italian parents are somehow behind, or that Italian labor law is late, and thus, you know, the standards of childhood are somehow late in Italy, right? That the Italian parents could not have succeeded in placing their children in jobs in France if they had not found people in France who are willing to cooperate with them, right? It required finding people in France who are willing to disregard laws that had been on the books in their own country for 40 years, and which these factory owners in France were still applying when it came to French-born children, right? So these people did not have the excuse that they were not used to children working under the age of 12. In fact, they were, and were following laws that said that, just not when it came to Italian children. So ultimately, the French government only finds a solution when it works with the Italian government. The two governments have to collaborate to create a more universal standard. And so in 1910, the French and Italian government sign an accord. And what this entails is that the French will protect their workers in Italy, and that the Italians will protect their workers in France, so that they're going to be responsible for the immigrants to the other countries. The other thing that they mandate is that Italian children have to go through their own consulate in France to get a livret. So it's a lot harder to fudge records if you're having to go through your own consulate where the people speak your language. And the other thing is both governments agree to ban children working in glassworks. And so what ultimately has to happen, what we see then, is that both governments have to come to a common standard about childhood, right? It's not enough for one country to set a standard around childhood. You have to create a more universal version of childhood that applies across the border, this transnational idea of childhood. And what that does then is eliminates the hierarchy within the laws in France, right? It's only by creating a transnational version that we're able to eliminate this hierarchy in France that does not depend on nationality. But then, of course, the great irony is that labor inspectors started finding Spanish children. So they only had so much success. So in conclusion, what I am trying to argue in this talk is that the challenges that the French Third Republic faced in regulating the work of immigrant children captures the limits of this idea of French Republican citizenship that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. Right, if we look at the child labor laws, they carve out childhood in these terms that seem very universal, very neutral. You know, all children have these various developmental stages. And yet if we study these various instances where the labor inspectors, in fact, found violations involving immigrant children, we see that, in fact, the laws had less applicability when it came to immigrant children. So their application was not as neutral as the laws would make them seem. And what I have shown is that it's not simply a failure of immigrant communities to adapt to French norms, but we also see a failure of French employers and French officials to accept that immigrant children are, in fact, within this category of childhood, and that the child labor laws do apply to them. And so to curb the exploitation of these foreign workers, the French had to change the way that all these various actors perceived these children. Right? They couldn't just legislate laws and things around childhood. They actually had to work to create a more universal vision of childhood, a more universal ideal of childhood that applied equally to all children. And I actually want to end by talking about my own experiences of working with children. So in this north corner of Paris, there's an after-school program for immigrant children in France today. And these are not Italians and Belgian children, but children from North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And it showed me and shows you the ways in which these challenges persist, that there's still this ideal of universal childhood, of French universalism, this neutral idea of anybody can be French, and yet the experiences these children are having and the way that they're perceived, there's still this division within the reality of childhood and the sort of neutral language of childhood that is in the legislative record in France. So thank you.